There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
He is not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why.
I used to be ashamed of hating him so much, but now I will carefully cherish my hatred and contempt to the last days of my life.
Those two quotes are about two different people, one fictional and the other real. The first quote comes from Robert Louis Stevenson's classic tale of terror, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The person being described is Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll's evil counterpart. The second quote is from Charles Darwin, who rarely ever spoke ill of anyone. Two quotes, two different people. One evil and the other, well, evil is much too strong a word, but both could be talking about the same person. 19th century biologist and paleontologist Richard Owen. History has not been kind to Richard Owen. There was a time when those quotes wouldn't have applied to the man at all. Long before Stevenson had the nightmare that led to his novel, and years before Darwin felt the way he did when hearing Owen's name, Owen was what you would call an up-and-comer. At least in the Society of British Science. Even Darwin liked the man, and this was way before publishing On the Origin of Species in 1859. That's when their relationship hit a snag. Actually, it was more than a snag, it was a Cold War. There were hints in those early days, before all of that happened, that Richard Owen was not exactly someone you would want to hang out with. But we'll get to all of that. We'll start at the very beginning. By that I mean his coming into the world, which he did in 1804 in the country town of Lancaster. Lancaster had once been home to the Romans, but little is known about that time. You can still see the Roman ruins there today, but not that Owen really cared. He was too busy fighting for the attention of his parents. He had 5 other siblings to contend with. So to pass the time, he studied. His first thoughts were to go into medicine. Many bright young men held the same aspirations. But then he accepted a minor position at the Royal College of Surgeons as an assistant to the naturalist William Clift. Now, Clift was, by all accounts, a very kind and gentle man. He may not have passed this demeanor on to Owen, but he did pass on a love for science. Owen eventually decided that a medical practice wasn't in his future. He instead wanted to become a naturalist. Owen's star quickly rose, and he wasn't quiet about it. He wasn't one of those unassuming introverted scientific types that we often hear about. That role's been reserved for the Charles Darwins of the world. Owen was bold, he published papers, and he enjoyed the credit. Perhaps too much. In 1841, he published a paper titled Report in British Reptiles, Part 2. There was nothing extraordinary about Part 1, if there even was one. What made Part 2 remarkable was that it gave birth to a new word. You're probably familiar with it too. That word is dinosaur. The term dinosaur means terrible lizard. The dino comes from the Greek word dainos, which means terrible, and sauros means lizard. Owen came up with that. He came up with a lot of things. He also laid claim to a lot of things. The problem was that some of the things weren't his to lay claim to. One early example being a paper that he wrote shortly after his dinosaur paper. This paper was on belemnites, an extinct squid-like creature. Owen gave the impression that he was the discoverer of these creatures, and the truth is, he wasn't. They had actually been discovered by Channing Pierce, an amateur biologist. Poor Pierce had to sit in the shadows and watch as Owen was handed the Royal Medal for that discovery. No bad deed goes unpunished, if only that were always true, and Owen was eventually confronted with a misappropriation of discovery and voted off of both the Zoological Society Council and the Royal Society Council. Both would be career-ending blows to anyone else, but Owen's career was far from over. He refused to let it be. The controversy over belemnites are overshadowed by another one, at this time with the discovery of a dinosaur called the iguanodon. Owen claimed that one too. He didn't let facts get in the way. The fact in this case being that paleontologist Gideon Mantell had discovered it. Owen obviously didn't care. He wasn't one to perform his transgressions behind the scenes. He was very open about it. In 1841, Mantell was in a horrible carriage accident that injured his spine. Bedridden and pretty much unable to perform his duties, Mantell was separated from the work that he loved. And this pushed the door wide open for Owen to step in, rename some of Mantell's dinosaur discoveries, and to tell everyone that he had found them. Mantell died in 1852 after taking an overdose of opium. He'd been taking it as a painkiller because of the carriage accident. Mainly for physical pain, of course, but one can imagine there was a little bit of mental anguish there as well, with Owen running around changing history, Mantell's history. And when Mantell died, Owen wasn't finished with him. Who knows why he despised Mantell as much as he did, but to add fuel to the embers of a dead fire, Owen penned an addition to Mantell's obituary that he had been only a mediocre scientist. He then had Mantell's spine removed, the injured spine, had it pickled and placed on a shelf. But just like the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Owen had his good side. Not that his good side cared about the proper treatment of his fellow man. His good side cared more about the proper treatment and appreciation of science. Not so much its history, which we've already seen he claimed for himself, but the world's opinion of it. In the early 1850s, Owen worked with the English sculptor Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins to create life-sized dinosaur sculptures. These would be the very first of their kind. They were created for the Great Exhibition of 1851, and more were commissioned for the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace was an enormous glass and iron structure that was built in Hyde Park as an amazing exhibition building. And in 1853, on New Year's Eve, Owen hosted a dinner for 21 scientists in the leg of the iguanodon sculpture. The iguanodon, if you remember, was the discovery he had stolen from Mantell. Mantell had only been dead a year. By the mid-1850s, Owen was superintendent of the Natural History Department of the British Museum. I told you, he wasn't about to let controversy and being kicked off of the Royal Society's council stop him from making a name for himself. He had a vision to accompany his ambition, a public museum. And his vision was realized as well. In 1881, London's Natural History Museum was established and Owen was granted knighthood. I would bet that Mantell and a few others rolled over in their graves at that one. But think what you want about Richard Owen. He was persistent and loved science. Just like a jewel thief loves, well, jewels. He loved science so much that he brought his work home with him, much to the dismay of his wife. Yes, Owen was married. Somebody loved him. He had what was called the right of first refusal whenever an animal died at the London Zoo. He liked to study a recently deceased carcass as any good biologist would, just not in their own home as Owen liked to do. His wife once came home to the corpse of a rhinoceros in her hallway. Another time, the house was almost made unlivable by the stench emanating from pieces of rotting elephant. And to fight off the smell, she made her husband smoke cigars throughout the house, an order that he was happy to follow, as long as he could keep his carcasses. Now, if you were to compile two lists, one of Richard Owen's good deeds and the other containing all of his misdeeds, it's really hard to say which list would be longer. Now, if you were to ask Charles Darwin which list was longer, there's little doubt as to what his answer would be. It all has to do with a little theory that he came up with and Owen's reaction to it. In the beginning, and by beginning I mean when Owen first sought to make a name for himself, he fought against the concept of evolution. Now, at the time it was called transmutation, and this would have been in the 1830s. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had died in 1829, and the scientific community was still divided as to the merits of pretty much everything Lamarck had to say. Owen was of the mind that the proliferance of species was part of God's plan. And to account for the similarities in anatomy, he would admit to them and then point out that God must have used the same plan, only altered slightly. Mankind, though, was a special case. Now, that was in the 1830s. As Owen's experience as a scientist grew, he began to question his old beliefs. He was still convinced, by himself most likely, that it was all part of a divine plan, but he would allow for a type of transmutation. It was the perfect tool to carry out God's plan, whatever that may be. According to Owen, new species were born from prior species, not gradually though, but suddenly. A cow might suddenly give birth to a new species of cow, and those species would go their separate ways. Owen even allowed for what he once considered Lamarck's heretical theories to enter his mind. But transmutation, the gradual change of one species into another, was Owen's least favorite option. There's a good chance that he may have given it a little bit more credit than he let on if it hadn't been for the book that Robert Chambers published in 1844, that being the highly controversial book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Now, that book was the dividing line. You either loved it or you hated it. You were either on the side of science or God's side. The public's reaction to that book is what may have forced Charles Darwin to keep quiet about his own theories for as long as he did. The same might be said for Owen. Owen even dipped his toes into the evolutionary waters. In 1849, he wrote on the nature of limbs, a favorite subject, and he suggested that it was possible that mankind emerged from the sea, that we used to be fish. Now, this went over like a lead balloon, as you can imagine. Remember, this was 1849. Proper society wasn't ready for such blasphemies. Some people even have trouble with it today, preferring not to think too hard about it. Now, if Owen bought into transmutation being responsible for the development of man, he put his foot down when it came to one obvious connection, that being apes. Gorillas had just been discovered, and it wasn't a far stretch of the imagination to imagine a gorilla walking upright. Owen, for reasons we can only guess at, sought to crush this train of thought. He was okay with fish, but monkeys? That was apparently out of the question. So to fight this, Owen pointed to primate brains. These, he said, had nothing in their structure similar to our own. Plus, to top it off, our brain size in relationship to our body size literally speaks volumes about the difference. Great apes have much smaller brains, especially when compared to their body size. And of course, this removed them from any evolutionary consideration when it came to man's origins. Where was Charles Darwin during all of this? Well, he was there. He was watching from the sidelines, nervous about his own opinions on the matter. Now, for years, he had been collecting evidence to support his theory that all species had evolved from a common ancestor, and that the proliferation of species was like a giant tree, with a series of common ancestors splitting off in all sorts of marvelous directions. Man was part of this tree as well. Darwin even harbored his own thoughts about that origin, thoughts he would only hint at when he published his magnum opus in 1859, and he developed further years later. But in the early 1850s, while they can't be said to have been close friends, Darwin and Owen were peers and they did get along. There's evidence of this in letters. But in 1859, all of that changed. The months leading up to the publication of On the Origin of Species were nerve-wracking ones for Charles. Alfred Russel Wallace had just sought his help in announcing his own theory, and Darwin was shocked and dismayed to find that it mirrored his own. Both men had reached the same conclusion. Natural selection drove evolution. It would continue to do so forever. What Darwin had on his side was mountains of evidence and notes that he had been putting together since his voyage on the HMS Beagle in the 1830s. Wallace's conclusions were more recent. Nevertheless, Darwin did the honorable thing and presented Wallace's theory at the same time as his own. If anything, it gave it more weight to have two naturalists behind it instead of one. He also knew that he couldn't wait any longer before publishing his book. The time had come. In his nervousness, he sent copies to friends and peers, and one of those quote-unquote friends was none other than Richard Owen. Richard Owen read the book, and he praised Darwin's work to his face. He told Darwin that it offered the best explanation published when it came to the formation of species. And that was to Darwin's face. But behind the scenes, Owen furiously penned a review of the book, which he published anonymously. That review appeared in the Edinburgh Review in April of 1860. In his review, when it came to Darwin's notes about the behavior of ants and other animals, Owen was at first complimentary.
These are the most important original observations, recorded in the volume of 1859. They are, in our estimation, its real gems.
He was also quick to note that these gems were
few indeed and far apart, and leaving the determination of the origin of species very nearly where the author found it.
He basically said, "Thank you, Mr. Darwin, for what could be a small paper about animal behavior, but instead you turned into an entire book that does little to improve upon our knowledge when it comes to species." I'm sure Darwin was thrilled.
It is assumed by Mr. Darwin that variations, useful in some way to each being, occur naturally in the course of thousands of generations, that such variations are reproduced in the offspring, and, if in harmony with external circumstances, may be heightened in still further modified descendants of the species.
Thus begins his next criticism, this aimed directly at what many at the time considered to be the book's fatal flaw. The idea is that variations, those which are passed on to an organism's offspring, can sometimes be beneficial to survival. According to Owen, it was obvious that
the transmission and exaggeration of a variety, step by step in the generative series, essential to the theory of natural selection, implies the fertility of the individuals constituting the several steps of the series of transmutation. But numerous instances, familiar to every zoologist, suggest an objection which seems fatal to the theory, since they show extreme peculiarities of structure and instinct in individuals that cannot transmit them.
And why?
Because they are doomed to perpetual sterility.
Doomed to sterility. This was something Darwin took great pains to explain throughout his book. Variations do occur, and while they can lead to a failure in survival, they can also lead to success. And where one finds success, one finds an organism's ability to overcome the obstacles of its environment. Nature selects for those variations and abilities and even behaviors. Owen, of course, saw none of this, or if he did see it, he didn't want anyone else to see it, which led him to conclude that
such are the signs of defective information which contribute, almost at each chapter, to check our confidence in the teachings and advocacy of the hypothesis of natural selection. But, as we have before been led to remark, most of Mr. Darwin's statements elude, by their vagueness and incompleteness, the test of natural history facts.
He even descends into pettiness.
We are not concerned in the author's beliefs or inclinations to believe. Belief is a state of mind short of actual knowledge.
Darwin was shocked, hurt, and furious at first. Here was a man he thought he could trust, a man whose opinion he valued, and instead of coming to Darwin personally with any objections to the book's conclusion, Owen instead publishes an anonymous critique. A scathing one meant to undermine everything the book set out to do. Like Owen had done to Mantell before him, any time a new sun was rising, Owen's first inclination was to squash it. Darwin wrote,
I often saw Owen whilst living in London and admired him greatly, but was never able to understand his character and never became intimate with him. After the publication of the original Species, he became my bitter enemy, not owing to any quarrel between us, but as far as I could judge, out of jealousy at its success.
He even reminisced about warnings he had been given about Owen. The first one had come from Scottish paleontologist Hugh Falconer.
Poor old Falconer had a very bad opinion of him, being convinced that he was not only ambitious, very envious and arrogant, but untruthful and dishonest. His power of hatred was certainly unsurpassed. When in former days I used to defend Owen, Falconer often said, "You will find him out some day," and so it has proved.
And find him out he did, in the most public of ways. He called Owen
spiteful, extremely malignant, clever, and damaging.
He was also quick to note that he wasn't alone in his thinking.
The Londoners say he's mad with envy because my book is so talked about. It's painful to be hated in the intense degree with which Owen hates me.
If Darwin was at all reticent about fighting back, others were not, especially Darwin's bulldog himself, Thomas Huxley. Huxley was more than happy to step into the ring on Darwin's behalf, gloves tied and ready. One of the first things that Huxley did was to attack Owen's assertion that man could not have descended from an ape-like ancestor. Remember, Owen had stated, and had done so many times with confidence, that the brains of primates had nothing in common with that of humans, from its size to its brain structure. Owen claimed that there were structures that were essential to the human brain that were missing from ape brains, one example being the hippocampus minor. To combat this, Huxley staged demonstrations where an ape brain was dissected to show that it did in fact contain these supposedly missing pieces. In spite of these facts, Owen continued to make his statements and Huxley continued to throw punches. And with each round that he won, Huxley gained more converts. People were starting to listen. And as a result, Darwin's book flew off the shelves and many bright minds began to consider that he might be right about the origin of species after all. A mad search began for transitional fossils, anything to help support Darwin's thesis. One of these transitional fossils popped up in a German limestone quarry in 1861. At first glance, it appeared to be the fossil of a bird. A second glance revealed that it also had reptilian features. This, of course, was the very first discovery of an Archaeopteryx fossil. This discovery landed in everyone's lap only 2 years after the publication of On the Origin of Species. It was a major find and major evidence. So what did Owen do? He bought it. He grabbed it, he brought it back to London, and he conducted his own analysis and claimed it was a bird and nothing more. He couldn't keep it locked away for long. He had, after all, purchased it for the British Museum. Once everyone else had a look, it was obvious that Owen wasn't simply wrong, he was disastrously wrong. And, some even claimed, a liar.
I used to be ashamed of hating him so much, but now I will carefully cherish my hatred and contempt to the last days of my life.
Every good story needs a villain, and there has been quite a few in the history of evolutionary theory. And if I've been somewhat mean to Richard Owen in this episode, it's only because his actions do make it easy to focus on his flaws. But let's take the high road for a moment. Richard Owen did fight to bring science to the public, where before, museum pieces were reserved for scientists and kept behind locked doors. He also loved what he did, and I'm sure he loved his family as well. Perhaps the reason that I have a problem with Richard Owen was his inability to allow others to share the spotlight, to the point of claiming their work as his own, or for trying to discredit works that he didn't come up with himself. Owen outlived Charles Darwin by 10 years, and Darwin died in 1882. Every morning, as he entered the British Museum to begin the long climb up the grand staircase to his office, Owen had to pass under the stony gaze of Darwin's marble statue. The 2-ton statue was placed there in 1885. But even after death, the animosity between the two continued, at least symbolically. In 1927, Darwin's statue was moved and a statue of Owen took its place, its highly visible place. Owen enjoyed this spot for the next 82 years, until 2009, the 150th anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species, when Darwin's statue finally reclaimed its spot. Evolution Talk is written and produced by myself, Rick Coast. The music on this episode was composed and performed by Poddington Bear. Support for Evolution Talk comes from you, simply by listening. Your support is greatly appreciated. And you can always reach me by using the site's contact page at evolutiontalk.com or on Twitter, where you can find me at Rick Coast. And most of all, thank you for listening, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
I discovered that.
No, you didn't.
I discovered the iguanodon then.
I have to say, you did not.
Well then, I think I'll establish a museum.
That's much better. Good luck to you.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.